In 1975, in France, the Simone Veil law went through. Simone Veil was a concentration camp survivor, and it was the law that allowed legal abortion with the services of a doctor who would not judge morally the woman who was aborting. She had to defend it for 25 hours in front of an assembly of 481 men, 9 women, and she had to withstand very strong reaction and attacks. Some of them were personal. She attributed this fact to male privilege at the time, to a fear that their virility was being attacked. And what I can surmise is that it had to do with a very old privilege, which was to actually control women's body. In fact, pregnancies as well as abortions, as we can see, are partly controlled by men in the 18th century. The century is framed by odd affairs. For instance, around 1754, there is something called dansomanie, which is a fear that the new dances involving some kind of waltz is turning and spiraling women's body to the point that their imagination is inflamed, their body becomes busy, and they may be subject to aborting if they are pregnant. Whereas for men, that dance is considered an art. Elisabeth Clare is the author of such articles. Earlier during the century, there is one of the last witchcraft trials involving Jean-Baptiste Girard, who is directing young women, young girls, I should say. And one of them, Marie-Catherine Cadière, or La Cadière, is going to accuse him of rape and of grooming her by making her confuse or mix up sexual arousal with divine intervention. And so the priest is accused of, among other things, making her abort by giving her some kind of reddish beverage and massaging her lower belly, which was one of the ways to achieve abortion at the time. So the problem is that the judgment occurs in 3 stages. He could be burnt at the stake. She could be hanged if she is actually accusing him as a defamation principle because of some ulterior motives. So they both risk their lives. Originally, the Jesuits managed to save the Girard and the Père Girard, and La Cadière is supposed to be hanged. People are very, the Jansénistes and the women of the nobility in particular, are so incensed that it's retrialed. Well, anyways, to make a long story short, nothing happens eventually. So what part of the scandal was that if she was supposed to have bouts of quietism, which is moments when she would faint and hear voices and predict the future, it becomes awfully similar to what is considered also scandalous at the time, which are the Quakers, and which is the whole affair is not very acceptable in the eyes of the church. Anyways, so that occurs around 1731, and the Jansenists are also using it against the Jesuits. So the Jesuits are shown as depraved, loving self-whipping and whipping as an arousal. So the arousal here, what is interesting is that what is interesting in the abortion system is that who has control over it, but eventually who has control of each other's body or of one's own's body. In the principle of self-whipping that the Jesuits are supposed to be practicing, they therefore arouse almost mechanically their body, or women's body in the case of Thérèse Philosophe. Although Thérèse Philosophe is basically a novel, a 1748 novel, which is pornographic and based on the scandal of the Girard-Lacatière trial, it also tries to rehabilitate women's sensual arousal as natural, perhaps automatic, but natural. And also it tries to indicate ways to prevent pregnancies. Which is in letter 81 of Dangerous Liaison, is one of the points of Marquise de Merteuil, who is talking to Valmont and telling him, as you engage without dangers, you should act without precaution, entirely taken up with some new inclination, you give way to it without fear, etc. The suggestion is that, of course, his reputation is not at stake, and he cannot fall pregnant. I mean, he cannot become pregnant. There is a very, the scene that I'm showing here is Valmont writing on the back of a prostitute a letter to Madame de Tourvel. And the interesting part is the manipulation of men, of women's bodies, as you can see here, a woman as a table, or women being manipulated psychologically as Madame de Tourvel, or even Cécile, who has no idea that she is pregnant, which is interesting because in the laws of the French 18th century, since you cannot tell the difference between abortion and pregnancy, you should declare your pregnancy as soon as you know that you are pregnant, so that you can be followed and by the neighbors and the family and the priests. And it is clear that you didn't, if you have an accident, that it was an accident and it was a stillbirth and not an abortion. So it's part of the, so anyways, a lot of people do claim that they cannot understand, or they do not see the difference, or that they didn't know enough about sexuality. And so that's one of the details. Anyway, Cécile has a stillbirth. It's caused by fear. Apparently, women's imagination is extremely strong, and fear can actually provoke a stillbirth involuntarily, or you can throw yourself down steps, or you can drink poisons and that have been known since antiquity to provoke abortion. So there is another stillbirth, which is nearly an abortion, which is under the control of the father of Julie in Rousseau's novel Julie, or La Nouvelle Héloïse. Basically the father is irate because Julie is pregnant, and he beats her up because he considers that Saint-Preux is a vagrant, a good for nothing. And the conclusion of Julie is that her father was sweet because he ended up taking her on her lap. And here is the quote translated: "I did not deserve the honor of being a mother. My expectation remained always vain, and it was refused to me to expiate my fault at the expense of my reputation. You knew what accident destroyed the germ that I carried in my breast," etc., etc. The passage is relatively obscure. You could skip it. Basically, what is notable is that the father basically pushes her, and her head ends against the table and it bleeds. The bleeding being the signal that she's losing her child. So basically a moral weakness, which is Cécile being so incredibly weak, ignorant, so impressionable with either through the senses or through fear, makes her lose her child. Otherwise, some kind of moral flaw can make you lose your child, or overexerting yourself, making love when you're pregnant. Or now that's interesting. There is the article by D'Alembert on abortion, and then in the encyclopedia mentions that abortion is stealing a subject from the king, so he's against it. He himself was an abandoned child from a mother that had been a nun and was allowed to rejoin the world, but that's another story. Anyway, she abandoned him, but with signs so that his father could retrieve him. So the abandonment was indeed an alternative to abortion, but the children that were orphans were very often didn't live very much, very long. An alarming amount of people died. By 5 years old, more than 50% of them were dead, which is part of the scandal of Rousseau, who claims that he abandoned his children. So another portion, so the weakness of the women that do not allow them either morally or physically to carry through a pregnancy is also part of the reflection in the encyclopedia about the fetus, and about that that points us to different articles on monsters. So apparently the philosophers are not very interested in anomalies or bi-gendered babies. They considered that corrective operations can occur. There are very few illustrations except for hermaphrodism. And there is one for some bodies without head. So it's part of a legend for some kind of nation that occurred in antiquity. But anyways, apparently there are some babies born without head, and Diderot considers that they are part of the mother's body because they die when they are born. But anyways, there are very few of those considerations. However, you can see that in these articles, either about monsters or about fetus, which is birth, spelled Foetus, Jaucourt is fighting, probably Jaucourt is fighting Benjamin Babelot, who in 1788 wrote a book called The Powers of Motherly Imagination Over the Fetus. And Jaucourt claims that it's probably an imaginary reaction of people viewing the children after they are born. He considers, so there are several ways to consider either pre-germs or accidents or whatever. Anyways, eventually Diderot considers that the power of imagination are indeed very strong, since you can die of tickling. But that, I don't know the logic here, but that's what he says. But apart from that, he also considers that a viable human being is only a variation, and therefore any variation is just part of a mutation, which is possibly the future of humanity. So there is some kind of scientific explanation for, they are seeking anyways, a scientific explanation for beings that are not exactly in the norm of the time, but they consider that it's just simply, one of the quotes from Rousseau is that the whole world is in motion and that we are all switching. Switching. Anyways, that's basically the end of my presentation. Thank you, and see you at ASEX.